From these data it follows that only the number of horses in 1925 did not reach the level of 1916. The number of cattle, sheep and pigs already in 1925 was more than in 1916. Horse population during the imperialist and Civil War total more affected. Usually, it is restored more slowly than other types of livestock. As for pig production, it is faster than other livestock species, which is capable of rapid expansion. Only in 1924 the number of pigs increased by 72%. In general, it should be noted that the restoration and recovery of agriculture over the years have been successful. Despite the difficult, arid 1921, the USSR agriculture reached 5 years before the war, and in 1926 surpassed these dimensions. The countries of capitalism participants in the World War needed at least 10 years to reach the pre-war level of agriculture. In Germany, in 10 years the production of basic cereals has grown by 21%. In France, even in 1931, pre-war cereal crops were not restored. In the country of the Soviets for 5 years, grain production increased by 77%. The same picture was observed in the field of animal husbandry. Germany relatively soon, in 1924, brought its horse stock up to the pre-war level, but the number of cattle in it was restored only in 1930, and the number of pigs. In 1927, France did not restore the pre-war level of its livestock of horses and pigs. The livestock of cattle she restored only in 1929. Thus, not only in industry, but also in agriculture, the Soviet system found in the first years of the NEP its enormous advantages over the system of capitalism. As a result of the rise of agriculture, on the one hand, and industry on the other, the economic link between town and country has significantly strengthened. The output of agriculture intended for the market grew faster than that consumed within the peasant farms, while the output of cereals as a whole increased by 77% inclusively from 1921 to 1925, the collection of wheat grew by 125%, sugar beet by 21 times and cotton by 27 times. The rapid development of the production of crops, which constitute raw materials for the light and food industries, attests to the growing connection between socialist industry and small-scale agriculture. Grain crops in value terms were produced at 3,722 million against 4,214 million pre-war rebels. In 1,913-14, that is, by 12% less. Technical crops were collected for 699 million against 654 million pre-war rebels, or 106.9% of the pre-war size. Gross livestock production reached 2,766 million, compared to 2,853 million pre-war rebels, or 97% of the pre-war level. From these data it follows that agriculture has become more intense than before the war. Agricultural cooperation grew and strengthened. The party consistently passing from one stage to another, higher, carried out the Leninist cooperative plan. In 1925, the entire network of agricultural cooperatives of the country consisted of 54,813 primary cooperatives of various types, mainly supply and marketing, covering 6,589,000 peasant farms, which accounted for about 28% of all farms in the country. Characteristic for the recovery period is that the most intensive was cooperation in areas where the peasantry was engaged in special crops. In 1926, cooperation in the dairy areas reached 97%, potato growing 77%, tobacco growing and beet growing 80%, etc. From these data it is clear that the closer and closer the agriculture was associated with the socialist industry, the more intensively it cooperated. The leading role of socialist industry here is particularly evident. At that time the main types of agricultural cooperation were agricultural credit partnerships, general, universal agricultural partnerships, special partnerships and collective farms. In total, there were over 50 different types of primary cooperatives. Agricultural cooperation on the production, processing and marketing of cereals and oilseeds has united over 1 million members. In 1925, out of 50,000 hectares of sugar beet sowing in peasant farms, 30,000 hectares were planted with beet-growing partnerships. A special scope from the first years of the NEP acquired cotton-growing cooperation and cotton-growing areas. The number of agricultural cooperatives of all kinds in the first 5 years of the new economic policy increased by 326%. But this growth was mainly due to cooperation in the field of supply and sales. Relying on Lenin's instructions, the 14th Party Conference detailed the measures for the development of cooperation in the countryside. The conference stressed that, in conditions of growing commodity turnover and the prevalence of small commodity production in the countryside, cooperation is the main socio-economic form of communication between the state economy and the small commodity producer. At the same time, the cooperation was to ensure control and regulation of small-scale production and trade turnover. The primary objectives of agricultural and credit cooperation were recognized. A. Organization of a cooperative loan. B. Organization of processing and marketing of agricultural products. C. Development of collective forms of farming, collective farms. D. Supplying the broad peasant masses with means of production. The decisions of the 14th Party Conference played an exceptional role in the development of agricultural cooperation. The peasant went to production cooperation in the most simple, easy and accessible ways. He began with the unification, the cooperation of his trading activities. However, there have been some shifts in the field of production cooperation. During the first 5 years of the NEP, the number of collective farms of all kinds increased 1.5 times from 10,521 to 15,178. The number of agricultural articles increased, although insignificantly, from 8,067 in 1920 to 8,802 in 1925, that is, by 10%. The number of partnerships for joint cultivation of land, TOZA, has significantly increased. Work in this form of uniting peasant farms without socializing the means of production. This form of cooperation was also more accessible, simple and understandable for the peasant than other types of industrial cooperation of his farm. Therefore, TOZAs at that stage grew faster than other forms of collective farms. The financial situation of agricultural cooperation has strengthened. As of January 1, 1924, the entire system of agricultural cooperatives had 300 million rubles, including borrowed funds. By October 1, 1925, this amount had increased to 900 million rubles. Own means of cooperation amounted to 130 million rubles. The remaining 770 million rubles were subsidized by the state. These figures show how the Soviet state helped the rise of cooperation. Of particular importance at that time in strengthening the link between socialist industry and the peasant economy was the system of contracting, contractual relations between state procurement agencies and peasant farms. The expansion of contracting went mainly through special technical crops. The contract for the supply of sugar beet and cotton by the end of the recovery period covered the vast majority of beet-growing and cotton-growing peasant farms. The growth of cooperation in the countryside, its promotion into the sphere of production, as well as the strengthening of the link between socialist industry and peasant farming, took place in the conditions of the development of commodity relations. The development of commodity production in the countryside is a contradictory, two-sided process. On the one hand, it more closely linked the working masses of the peasantry to the socialist city, and on the other, it was the basis for the growth of the kulaks. At that time a class stratification was taking place in the Soviet village, but its character radically differed from the class stratification of the village under capitalism. In the countries of capitalism, as is known, polarization occurs, that is, the growth of the opposite social groups of the village, due to the ruin and erosion of the middle peasantry. Under Soviet conditions, the middle peasant massif was not destroyed, but increased. From 1924-25 to 1925-26, the number of poor farms fell from 24 to 21.6%. The middle peasant group of farms increased from 64.7 to 65.8%. At the same time, the number of farms that employed term workers increased from 6.9% to 7.6%. In order to clarify the features of class differentiation in the village of that time, let us compare the above data on the correlation of the social groups of the peasantry with those figures that Lenin once gave, analyzing the social composition of the village. Lenin believed that the poor peasants in pre-revolutionary Russia accounted for about 67% of the entire peasantry, middle peasants, 20%, and the kulaks, 13%. Compared with pre-revolutionary, the share of the average peasantry increased more than threefold. At the same time, the share of the poor decreased more than threefold, with a significant reduction in kulak farms. It would be incorrect to assign all 7.6% of peasant farms that employed term workers to kulak farms. Among the hired term workers there was a certain part of the middle peasant farms. Usually in the village there were many such facts when the average farming due to illness, the care of an adult member of the family in the city, or the Red Army, attracted to help for the summertime of the worker. The capitalist character of the economy is determined, however, not by the occasional, accidental recruitment of term workers, but by the regular employment of hired labor. Comrade Molotov, to determine the kulak type of economy at the XV Congress of the party, took the sign of the simultaneous application of wage labor and rent. At that time there were 3.7% of such farms. This is the figure that determined the actual number of kulak farms in our country by the end of the recovery period. In comparison with the pre-revolutionary period, this meant a decrease in kulak farms by almost 4 times. The kulak could not acquire the former economic strength, because the land was in the hands of the state. It was withdrawn from the sphere of circulation. Commercial, credit, tax, cooperative policy of the Soviet government was directed at the all-round limitation of the exploiting tendencies of the kulaks and on the rise of the well-being of the working masses of the peasantry. Let us analyze in some detail the stratification taking place in the village on various socio-economic grounds. According to the materials of the Central Statistical Bureau in August 1926, about 1,700,000 farm laborers were employed in individual farms. By this time there was a significant increase in the number of farm laborers. The growth of the wage labor employed in kulak farms is the most important indicator for characterizing the capitalist exploitation of the poor at that time. Another characteristic indicator of the growth of kulak farms was the growth of crops on leased land. In 1924, throughout the RSFSR, the percentage of farms with sowing on leased land was 3.6, and in 1925 it increased to 5.4. That is, in 1 year the percentage of farms with sowing on leased land increased by 1.5. If we take as a whole the sowing on leased land in the RSFSR, then in 1924 it was 2.4%, and in 1925, 4.1%. As a rule, the land was leased to the poor. Although the land was rented not only by kulaks, but also by middle peasants, nevertheless, figures on the growth of rent reflect, mainly, the growth of the kulak group of farms. The third sign of the growth of the kulaks was the increase in the group of farms that had a large number of cattle. For example, in 1924 for the RSFSR, farms with 4 or more cows were 2.2%, and in 1925, already 2.3%. Farms with 4 or more heads of draft animals in 1924 were 2%, and in 1926, 2.1%. The fourth sign of the growth of the capitalist exploitation of the village was the use of fists of their livestock and implements for the exploitation of the poor. In these cases, The kulak processed the land of the poor with its working cattle and agricultural implements. The poor allegedly hired piecework workers, but in fact went to bondage to the kulak. This form of capitalist exploitation was especially prevalent at that time. The kulaks, it gave the possibility of a kind of camouflage and circumvention of the laws of Soviet power aimed at protecting the interests of the poor. The facts testified that it was the poor farms that usually invited the so-called piecework workers with their working cattle and agricultural implements to work. For example, according to a special poll conducted by the CSO in the spring of 1926, in a number of districts of the RSFSR, farms that sowed up to 1/10 were forced to make such a deal in fairly large amounts. From the group of farms with sowing from 1 to 2 desiatines, 23.9% hired piece workers, while a group of farms with large sowing, from 16 to 25 desiatines and above, resorted to this hiring. In the extreme case, such farms from this group was no more than 1.5%. Hence it is clear that such a kind of hiring was resorted mainly to the poor farms, and in this form the shameless exploitation of the poor from the kulak farms took place. Usually this help was carried out on enslaving conditions, which provided a big earnings for kulak farms. It is known that our village in the pre-war period supplied a huge number of seasonal workers. According to pre-war statistics, there were at least 6 million workers in this category. In 1925-26, the number of seasonal migrant workers reached 3 million. Private capital here also found a sphere of activity that was profitable for itself. According to studies made at that time, private capital occupied about 15–20% of all construction workers at Khodnikov. Usually a private entrepreneur or contractor employed hires and then took contracts from the state and thus exploited the workers. Despite the rapid rise in the country's productive forces in the country and the countryside, all the labor resources of the village were not fully used at that time. The solution of the question of the use of surplus labor was, above all, of great importance to the rural poor. In this regard, the party and the Soviet government carried out a series of measures to improve the situation of the poor and low-income strata in the village. Among these measures, we should first of all refer to the rise of agriculture on the basis of its intensification, the growth of agricultural cooperation, and the development of artisanal, as well as offshore fisheries. At the same time, for the same purposes, the 14th Party Conference, April 1925, recognized the possibility of facilitating the conditions for the use of subsidiary wage labor in agriculture and the short-term lease of land. The poor man, who felt an acute shortage in the means of production for cultivating the land that was in his use, was often forced by circumstances to go to bondage deals with the kulak. In this situation, the alleviation of the conditions for the employment of hired labor in agriculture and the short-term lease of land was at the same time a means of combating the enslavement of the kulaks. After the 14th Party Conference, the struggle against the exploiting tendencies of the kulak intensified. Transactions entered into legally were more easily subjected to state control. The 14th Party Conference emphasized the need for extensive industrial assistance to low-income peasant farms. All these decisions of the 14th Party Conference were also aimed at eliminating the survivals of war communism in the countryside. These decisions were the most important link in strengthening the alliance of the working class with the middle peasant. They were adopted in connection with the discussion of the issue of cooperation. Cooperation has become the main form of economic link between the socialist industry and small-scale agriculture. A sharp class struggle develops around it and inside the cooperation itself. The 14th Party Conference decided to include in the charters of all types of cooperation an item on the prohibition of kulak elements on the boards. Although the bulk of the cooperative peasant farms were middle peasants and the poor, nevertheless the kulaks in many cases climbed to the leadership of cooperatives and took a strong position in them. The task was to pull the kulaks out of the boards of the cooperatives. isolate them from the bulk of the peasantry and firmly win over the middle peasants to the side of the working class and the rural poor. In connection with the decisions of the 14th Party Conference, the party took a number of measures to strengthen the work among the rural poor. Decisions were made to create groups of the rural poor with the obligatory involvement of farm laborers in them. These groups in the villages, volsts and districts established close contact with the middle peasants in the struggle against the kulak, nominating themselves for the elections to the Soviets. The task of revitalizing the Soviets and the growth of cooperation in the countryside was inextricably linked with the organization and work of groups of the poor. Particular attention was paid to strengthening the involvement of the poor in cooperation. The Soviet state rendered aid to it when making its shares. The terms of lending to the poor were extended, and special funds were created to help the rural poor under the Central Agricultural Bank. For low-income peasant farms, privileges were introduced for land management, preferential forest leave, etc. Taxes for these farms were reduced or even eliminated altogether. On May 10, 1923, a single agricultural tax was introduced with the aim of streamlining the tax policy in the countryside and eliminating the multiplicity of forms of taxation. On the basis of the new law, the peasant knew in advance the amount of the tax due from him. Courtyard money, general civil, local, direct state taxes were abolished. From 1924 to 2525, the agricultural tax was fully paid in money. Work in the village became more complicated. Strengthening the alliance with the middle peasant as the central figure of the village was still in the center of attention of the Soviet state. In his struggle for the middle peasant, working class relied on the poor. The question of rendering all-round assistance to the poor peasants became extremely important. One of the main forms of the class struggle at that time was the struggle between the kulaks and the working class for leading the bulk of the peasantry. The FIST tried to lead the middle peasants and thereby turn the village on the path of capitalist development. The working class in the struggle against the kulaks strengthened its leadership of the main masses of the peasantry. The party pointed out that without a firm alliance of the working class with the middle peasant, without support of the rural poor, it is impossible to build victoriously socialism. The Soviet government consistently pursued a policy of strengthening the alliance of the working class with the middle peasant, limiting the capitalist tendencies of the kulaks. The restriction of the capitalist tendencies of the kulaks was ensured by the entire policy of the Soviet state, the socialist offensive, and the displacement of the capitalist elements in the economy, the growth of the socialist sector of the national economy, tax policy, labor legislation, the policy of grain procurement, etc. The organization of the poor and the consolidation of the alliance with the middle peasants in the struggle against the kulaks, the most important measures taken by the working class in its struggle to isolate the kulak. The Trotskyites tried with all means to thwart this great and complex political work of the party in the countryside. They deliberately exaggerated the strength of the kulaks and downplayed our strength. These despicable enemies of Bolshevism, in accordance with their attitude to the impossibility of the victory of socialism in our country, occupied a pronounced capitulatory position. They disrupted the work of organizing the poor and strengthening the alliance with the middle peasants and pushed the way of administration primarily towards the middle peasants, sought to preserve the methods of war communism and tried to provoke a civil war between the working class and the peasantry. The rout of the Trotskyites was a necessary condition for the victory of socialism in the countryside. The party declared a resolute struggle against naked administration in the countryside, for the elimination of survivals of war communism. The task was to educate and organize the working masses of the peasantry around the working class, to organize socialism together with them under the leadership of the working class. The Soviets and the cooperation in the countryside had a great task in organizing and educating the working masses of the peasantry. The Bolshevik Party raised and organized the political activity of the peasantry through councils, and its economic activity through cooperation. Now you cannot lead the way, because the political activity of the peasantry has risen, and it is necessary that this activity should turn into a Soviet form, that it should go through councils, and not in addition to advice. Supervised is the one who revives the councils and creates a peasant activist around the party in the village. It is impossible to manage the old way in the old way, because the economic activity of the village has risen, and this activity needs to take the form of cooperation, so that it goes through cooperation, and not in addition to cooperation. Supervised is the one who engages the cooperative community in the village. Lenin and Stalin collected works for the study of the history of the CPSU, B, Volume 3, pages 24-25. So Comrade Stalin raised the question of our political tasks in the countryside. The party firmly and unswervingly pursued a policy of limiting the exploiting tendencies of the kulak, relying on the rural poor, in every possible way strengthening the alliance with the middle peasant. The working class waged a ruthless struggle against the kulak. The capitalist elements of the village, the worst enemies of socialism, the kulaks, were systematically confined to the proletarian state. They were dealt one blow after another. On the basis of the Leninist cooperative plan, the Soviet government achieved major successes during this period in the struggle for socialism in the countryside.